Hello, my name is Noah Getz, and I'm a musician in residence faculty member at American University in Washington, D.C. I'm also an active performer and music entrepreneur. Grant writing has been one of the most powerful skills that I've developed in my career. I've received nearly $150,000 in individual grant funding for my projects, which has allowed me to create and produce my own programs, travel abroad for cultural exchanges, create concert series, and commission new works for the saxophone. Today I'm going to share with you some suggestions to help you improve your grant writing skills. This information will help those that are new to grant writing in the form of general tips, but will also speak more specifically to the challenges and opportunities that are available with the increased focus on diversity and equity in arts funding. Much of this presentation will focus on examples drawn from my experiences writing grants for musicians and ensembles, but these ideas are applicable to other kinds of initiatives as well. The last several years has seen a greater focus on equity and diversity in granting organizations. The development of these criteria reflects an important and long overdue recognition of the barriers that exist to obtaining funding for underrepresented groups. For those artists and musicians that are members of underrepresented groups, this may provide new opportunities for funding that didn't exist in the past. For those that are not members of underrepresented groups or may have received funding in the past without this new language, this presents a new opportunity and challenge to build meaningful connections and collaborations. I believe that music has always benefited from diversity, inclusion, and unique collaborations, so this shift has the potential to usher in a dynamic and vital new era in music creation. Finding the right fit. Understanding the mission of the granting organization. It is essential that you assess the fit of the grant program with your artistic aims before putting in the work to apply for the grant. For many musicians and small nonprofit organizations, the desire to seek funding from as many organizations as possible leads to potential overreach and a distortion of their artistic or mission goals to obtain funding. Consider looking at other organizations like yours in terms of size, mission, and musical style, and find out what grants they've received for their work. This should give you a sense of what organizations might align with your goals as well. Research grant opportunities and create a list of possible funding sources. As a first step, research grant opportunities and funding sources and create a list that includes typical deadlines for grant programs. Mark them on your calendar for next year if you have already missed the deadlines for this year. Look out for grants that have funded recordings, music series, and other programs that are in line with your interests, and include those in your list of potential funding opportunities. Make sure to research both nationally known programs like Chamber Music America and the National Endowment for the Arts, which are both highly competitive because they are so well known, as well as local, state, and institutional opportunities. Many times, these more localized grants are a great way to get comfortable with grant writing and can provide seed money for a larger project that could be compelling to larger funding agencies. When you find a grant that you think is compelling, make a list of the grant requirements and write a short blurb about how your project fulfills these requirements. This doesn't have to be comprehensive at first or take a lot of time. Your goal is to make sure that your ideas and the grant requirements are aligned. Pay close attention to language both in the grant funding request as well as the frequently asked questions section. Sometimes I have found discrepancies between these two documents and have had to contact the organization for clarification. At other times, I've learned more details about the organization or grant program by reading both. When possible, try to either get the grant questions in advance of working through the online portal, or, if this isn't possible, create an account and step through the portal questions and copy them to a Word document to work on the grant from there. This allows you to create language that will be useful in future grant requests and ensures that you don't lose your work in an unfamiliar online portal. Call the organization with questions you may have about the grant. Don't be afraid to call the grant officer for the grant program to ask specific questions about their grant requirements. While on the phone, you may even briefly discuss your program with them and get their opinion about its fit with their requirements. Generally speaking, the grant officer will not be judging your proposal, but they have worked to help create the guidelines and are in an excellent position to help understand the organization's larger goals. One time I called a grant officer to ask whether a recording project I wanted to pursue would fit within the guidelines of the DC Commission's Projects, Events, and Festivals grant. I'd received recording funding years earlier, but learned in our conversation that this kind of project was no longer being funded consistently, which led me to pursue an alternate idea. Consider serving as a judge or grant panelist. There's no better way to understand the grant program or the mission of the organization than participating on the panel judging the grants. Even though this can be very time-consuming, it can be very helpful when writing your own grant the following cycle. It can be difficult for young artists and musicians to be asked to participate in these panels, but you should inquire about this anyway. Many times more established musicians don't have the time or the desire to continue to serve on these panels, which provides an opportunity for others to participate. Make note of the comments that are being discussed and the weight being given to certain elements during the judging portion as a guide for your future grant proposal. If you happen to judge when you have a close colleague or your own project up for consideration, make sure to recuse yourself based on the guidelines given by the grant manager. If the fit isn't right, consider sending the grant information to a friend or colleague. This is a great way to help your network grow in a meaningful way. Musicians and artists will appreciate that you thought of them for this grant opportunity and may return the favor if they find something that might be a good fit for you. All right, here's your first assignment. Take 5 minutes to do a quick online research for grant opportunities. Create a document on your computer and cut and paste general information about these programs for further research later. Equity, diversity, and inclusion. Now that you have found the right fit for your grant program, you will most likely need to discuss how you address equity, diversity, and inclusion. This element will probably be a weighted portion of your score in the overall grant program. Here are some examples of this language from granting organizations. Chamber Music America Digital Residency Program. In keeping with its commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity, CMA seeks to understand the demographics of its membership and of the members who access its benefits and services. CMA uses ALAANA and white to identify race. DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. How does the applicant ensure all activities and modes of engagement are accessible to district residents and visitors with disabilities and of all backgrounds? Discuss the applicant's strategies to include people with disabilities, as well as other underserved populations, which include those whose access to professional arts and humanities experiences is limited by geography, ethnicity, and/or economics. Seek to build coalitions that enrich your projects. As a white male, I see this language as an opportunity to build coalitions and deepen my partnerships and understanding of my community as part of the granting programs. Washington, D.C. is a very diverse city, and the life experiences of those east and west of the Anacostia River are often very different. Part of the mission of the DC Commission on the Arts is to address this gap in access, wealth, and diversity, so they are appropriately invested in understanding how grant programs work for the betterment of all DC residents. Some of the ways that I have tried to address these questions in my own grants have included partnering with venues east of the river, as well as venues that are centrally located with easy metro and bus access. Creating my ensemble, the World Music Collective, that represents many musical and cultural traditions from around the world, and commissioning composers from underrepresented communities. For those that identify as members of underrepresented groups, I would also seek to strengthen and build coalitions in your work. It may seem less necessary depending on how weighted the grant requirements are towards specific segments of the population, but I've found that thoughtful and rich collaborations and coalitions create strong programming. They also help with venue access, advertising, and many other areas of a project proposal. Remember that service to underrepresented populations should include your potential audience. Often grant writers focus on their proposal and artists with less focus on the audience. Addressing underrepresented populations should also address the audience. Physical access to buildings is often specified in grant proposals, but location and access for those without easy transportation should be considered as well. If there's a live stream event, what considerations are being made for those without access to technology? Is the current venue one that feels unapproachable by a segment of the population? Sometimes museums feel that way, but libraries or venues attached to schools may not. What modes of advertising would reach underserved populations in your community the best? It might be local print newspapers or flyers rather than online advertising. Consider artistic content that tells the story of underrepresented communities or notable individuals. Music and the arts can be a powerful way of commemorating important events and individuals in a community. While your project may not fit into this category, you might consider doing some research to see if you can create a project around an important local figure or community that has traditionally been underrepresented. I was recently involved in a project called Unknown. This powerful song cycle told the story of those who had been silenced by war. Here's your next assignment. Take 5 minutes and brainstorm ways to answer the question posed by the DC Commission on the Arts. Discuss the applicant's strategies to include people with disabilities as well as other underserved populations, which include those whose access to professional arts and humanities experiences is limited by geography, ethnicity, and/or economics. Budget planning. One of the most daunting elements of writing a grant is creating the budget. When creating a budget, it is important to consider what you will actually need to complete your project, what expenses are allowable, and what additional things you might need that hadn't been on your radar. Figuring out what you need. Typically, grants require a budget that breaks down the costs associated with the project, including artistic expenses, which may be fees paid to the artist, including musicians, composers, or videographers if applicable, administrative fees, such as support personnel or bookkeeping, and other expenses. Make a list of what you need and then begin to estimate the cost of each item. There are usually very specific things that are allowed to be in the budget and those things that are not allowed, and could disqualify the project from consideration. Some typical non-allowable expenses include tuition fees, reception food and drink, and private fundraising events. When building your budget, try to make sure that you have covered all of the allowable expenditures while keeping an eye on the total to make sure that you haven't gone beyond the maximum allowable budget. Don't undercut a realistic budget for your project to make it more attractive. One common mistake that is typical of inexperienced grant writers is to ask for less than is actually required to complete the project. While it can be a good strategy to undercut the maximum budget to be competitive with larger projects, it is important to accurately reflect what you will actually need. Doing this demonstrates to the panel that you have the knowledge that it takes to carry out the project. Another reason to avoid undercutting your budget is that funding organizations don't always fully fund projects. You may need to streamline your final budget numbers regardless, and having a smaller budget to start with makes that more difficult. Remember to consider more than just artistic fees for your project. There are some typical things that inexperienced grant writers might miss when creating their grant budget. Do you need event insurance for your performance? If so, does it require a letter of subrogation, which costs more? Do you need someone to design your advertising, including logo, pictures, posters, etc.? Does your advertising extend beyond online marketing? If so, are there printing or copying costs involved? Do you need administrative staff to help you with the logistics of the project, which might include scheduling, taxes, or advertising support? Documentation. Once you have your budget set, obtain documentation to support it. If your project includes travel, I would consider using U.S. government per diem rates for lodging and food costs, which can be found at gsa.gov. If you need event insurance, you can use an online service like eventhelper.com to get a quote. If you know the artists or composers that you are planning to work with, ask them directly what they would want to be paid for their participation. It may be necessary to figure out a range that is possible within the grant guidelines so that you have an idea of what is possible when speaking with them. If you haven't made final decisions about the performers, you should consider using union rates as a basis for their fee structure. While some grants can accommodate this level of payment, it is good to try to pay your musicians and artists as generously as possible. Remember that they are your network for the next opportunities that you might be offered, and paying well helps everyone in our community to thrive. If you have additional questions for me, please feel free to ask. Thank you so much.